A few months ago, I was advising on a project for an artist, and she was working on a series of pieces inspired by the turning of the seasons, and she wanted to root the whole series in Celtic myth and custom. But when she got to midsummer, to the summer solstice, she emailed me and asked, "Is there a Celtic myth for this time of year?" And I had to tell her that there just isn't one. Not one that we know of, at least. There are stories for other times of the year, for the other festivals, but for the summer solstice, the longest day, the sun's highest point of the year, there's no known myth. Nothing in the old texts, no gods, no heroes, and almost no stories. After I responded, my client sent an email back and just asked me straight out, "Well, what's your best guess?" And that got me thinking. If we don't have a myth for the Celtic summer solstice, well, can we make a guess at what it might have been? Not by making something up necessarily, but by looking more carefully at what has survived. The customs and the traditions that people carried out on this day. Maybe they still carry echoes of an older story. This video is the first part of that investigation. Not for a written tale, but for a pattern that still shows itself in what people did. A story that may have once been told, but that's now only acted out in custom and tradition. I'm going to begin with the most visible clue, what people did, the behaviours they had to mark the longest day of the year. In this video, we're going to look at the customs that have survived in different Celtic regions, not to catalogue them all, but to ask, what do they suggest? What do they have in common? What kind of story were they all part of? And why, if this day was once so full of light, has its story gone so dark? The most widespread and dramatic custom of the summer solstice in the Celtic world was the lighting of fires on high ground. It still happens today in a few places, but not to the same degree as to what used to happen in the past. Of course, lighting fires on festival days isn't unique to the summer solstice nor to the Celts. It appears in many parts of Europe. But in the Celtic-speaking lands, it's especially persistent, and in some places, it's been remembered with unusual force. In Ireland, for instance, one of the clearest examples comes from Croagh Patrick, a mountain in County Mayo that has long been a site of pilgrimage. Today, it's best known as a place of Christian devotion, but the practice of climbing the mountain and marking it with ritual seems to go back much further. Sometimes people walked around the summit sunwise, a movement that may reflect the path of the sun at its peak. And what were these fires for? Well, the various Celtic fire customs all seem to have blended spectacle with symbolism. In some regions, fires were leapt over for luck or purification, a very common custom in plenty of other festivals like Bealtaine or Calan Mai. In Wales, large bonfires known as Coelcerth Mawr were lit on the hills at Gwyl Ifan, the summer solstice. Elias Owen, in his Welsh folklore, describes how on Midsummer Eve fires were kindled on the hills and young people danced around them. In Scotland, particularly in the Highlands, fire customs at midsummer included torch processions and the scattering of ashes on fields as a blessing. Again, another common custom at other festivals in other Celtic regions. In Brittany, the Feu de la Saint-Jean included dancing, singing, and the rolling of burning wheels down hillsides, clearly mimicking the sun's movement. Now there's a pattern here. Fires on the heights, movements that mirror the sun, ritual action at the turning of the light. But what's missing is a story and a character, some deity or hero. Was there once a myth that explained these actions? A story of the sun being at the height of its power? A turning point, perhaps a descent? If there was a mythic drama behind any of these firelighting customs, the story hasn't survived, only the gestures remain. If fire was one way to mark midsummer, water was another. Across the Celtic regions, people also turned to dew and wells as part of their solstice customs. These weren't acts of spectacle like the hilltop fires, but were more private, almost hidden. But they still hint at something just as deep. A reverence for the renewing power of nature, and maybe for the sun's presence within it. Let's start with dew. In Ireland, it was once believed that the dew gathered on midsummer morning had healing and beautifying properties. Kevin Danaher records in The Year in Ireland, on the morning of St. John's Day, it was considered beneficial to bathe one's face in the dew before the sun had dried it. The custom was particularly popular with young girls who believed it improved their complexion. This belief wasn't just found in Ireland, nor just on the summer solstice. In Scotland, particularly in the Highlands, people also sought out the dew at dawn, and also in Wales at Calan Mai. It was gathered from the grass and used as a form of blessing, to wash one's face, to sprinkle on the sick, or even to collect in bottles for later use. And then, of course, there are the wells. In Scotland again, midsummer was a time to visit sacred wells, a practice long associated with healing and spiritual renewal. Alexander Carmichael, in his Carmina Godelica, records how women would walk around these wells deersill, that is sunwise, sometimes 3 or 9 times as part of a ritual of blessing. In one account, he writes, on the morning of the Féile Ian, St. John's Day, the women went to Tober Ian. They walked thrice sunwise about it, sipped its water 3 times, and bathed their faces, that the year would be one of health and fruitfulness. In Wales, the practice of visiting wells at midsummer is less well documented, but there are traces. Some Gwyl Ifan customs mention people visiting springs and rivers at dawn, sometimes combining this with the collection of herbs like St. John's wort, which we'll come to shortly. And what links these customs? Well, they all involve collecting the sun's power as it appears to rest on the land, in dew, in water, perhaps in light itself. The timing was obviously crucial. These are, in many ways, dawn rites. The actions are gentle, sometimes intimate, washing, sipping, or circling. They point to a belief that at this moment, at the year's turning, the world is brimming with blessing. The sun has reached its highest point, and something of its energy is believed to settle into the earth and water. Now, this may not be myth in the usual sense. There are no names, there's no story, but it carries the outline of a sacred pattern. It also suggests another fragment of a possible mythic drama, not just fire on the mountaintop, but healing at the well. A solar being whose power blesses the land, whose light is felt not only in the sky, but in the moisture of the earth and the gathered waters of lakes and wells and springs and rivers. But again, there's no character, there's no narrative, there's just ritual behaviour. One of the clearest threads in the midsummer customs of the Celtic world is the gathering of plants, especially those with yellow flowers, perhaps believed to be at their most potent when the sun was at its peak. The most notable among these is St. John's wort, known in Welsh as Eirin Llys, literally the golden herb. So we'll begin in Wales. According to the 19th century folklorist Mary Trevelyan, St. John's wort was gathered on the eve of Gwyl Ifan, or St. John's Day. Trevelyan records, the herb was gathered with care on St. John's Eve and placed over doorways to guard against witchcraft and evil spirits. It was also used in divination, being placed under a pillow to bring dreams of one's future spouse. It wasn't simply a useful herb. It was a carrier of solar force, caught at the moment of its greatest strength. Ireland preserved similar customs. Kevin Danaher once again notes that in many rural areas, St. John's wort was picked and hung in the rafters of houses and stables, where it was believed to protect against lightning and fire. In the Scottish Highlands, Alexander Carmichael records that the herb was carried on the person as a charm against evil, particularly on Midsummer Night. And in Brittany, it was not only gathered, but sometimes thrown into the midsummer bonfires, a symbolic offering or a means of charging the household with protection for the coming season. So what do these customs tell us? Well, they show a belief in the power of the sun stored in plants, in flowers that catch the light. The act of gathering herbs wasn't just medicinal, but clearly ritual. In mythic terms, these are actions that might once have belonged to a character, some solar figure who bestows blessing, a guardian of light, a patron of herbs and healing at the highest point of the sun in its year. But again, what's missing is the one thing you might expect from cultures as rich in storytelling as those of the Celts, a myth. No surviving tale explains why these things were done. There is no obvious record of a solar deity whose fate turns at midsummer. No narrative of triumph, no story of sacrifice or descent. So what happened? Well, it's possible there was never a myth, that midsummer was marked only by action, not by story. But I always thought this was unlikely. Fire on hills, circles round wells, flowers gathered with ceremony, these are all shapes of ritual. And ritual usually implies myth, even if the story has been lost. It's more likely that the story once existed but just didn't survive. Perhaps it just wasn't written down. Perhaps it was absorbed into Christian reinterpretations of St. John's Day. Perhaps it simply faded with time. But I believe its outline still remains. I think there was a Midsummer Queen, and I think that we can recover her story. In the next episode, I'll be turning to the Neolithic peoples of Britain and Ireland, who were here long before the Celts, and I'll be asking the same question of their remains, of their stone monuments. What was their myth of the summer solstice, and did they pass it on to the Celts?